Welcome to Lesson 4, the final lesson for the spirit of independence. This is declaring independence. There are two topics associated with this lesson: the Second Continental Congress and declaring independence. There are only two related vocabulary terms for this lesson: a petition, a formal request, and, a, and the word preamble, the introduction to a formal document that often tells why the document was written. Quick before reading scan. The Second Continental Congress has a lot of subtopics here: distinguished leaders, key actions, the war heats up, and moving toward independence. The second topic here, declaring independence, has two subtopics: writing the Declaration and the Declaration of Independence. So it's clear where the first one is going. We're going to talk about distinguished leaders. What did they do? How did the war heat up? And how did they move toward independence? What led them to that? Page 131 has a great picture of the committee members of Franklin, Jefferson, and Adams, and they're examining the Declaration. And when we get there, we'll talk about that. Once again, we're going to apply our during reading strategies as we read by making connections, interacting with the text, and clarifying understanding. And we've been using these for a while now, so I won't go through the description of them all. I think we're all familiar enough with them now that we can do that. Our after reading strategies include recalling by summarizing the selection and writing her out loud, responding, drawing logical conclusions about the topic, and forming opinions. And once again, we use the questions in the textbook to do that. And evaluate, determine how evidence is used, forming judgments about whether the selection is objective or biased. And once again, these are often document analysis or DBQ skills. So if at the end of this we draw an inference or we have an insight, that is okay to do. We can do that. So let's get into the reading. And this starts on page 128. How did individuals and events impact efforts for independence? Who was involved in it? And what was the significance of the olive branch petition? There's one of our vocab words, petition. Why is that so significant here? So let's jump right into it. We are on page 128. What motivates people to act? What motivates these people to act? And actually, we kind of answered that. We'll get to it. We did. It was one of the questions. Well, we did answer that. We'll get to it. So let's get into the reading. In 1774, the Continental Congress agreed to meet again if the British did not address their complaints. In fact, as the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775 showed, the dispute between the British and the colonists worsened. So what I know, the Continental Congress met in 1774 to oppose the laws of Parliament, establish a colony-wide boycott, and to support the Suffolk Resolve. So we know the Suffolk Resolves are one of the things that led to the actual battle, right? So problem solution. Lexington and Concord and the fighting around Boston heightened tensions between the colonists and British. And the Continental Congress has to find a way to resolve the tension. How are we going to deal with this now? We're effectively at war with Great Britain. What do we do? Distinguished leaders. The Second Continental Congress met on May 10, 1775. The delegates include some of the greatest leaders in the colonies. Among them were John and Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, and George Washington, all delegates to the First Continental Congress. Several new delegates came as well, so we'll get to know them in a minute, but there must have been a lot of worry and concern going into this meeting. I mean, basically, whatever decisions they made could make them traitors, and traitors back then were hung at the neck. So, this must have been on their minds when they were meeting. Question and answer. Sam and John Adams, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, and George Washington met previously during the meeting of the First Continental Congress. Just so you know who these people are, Sam and John Adams, well-known Boston attorney. Sam Adams was a Boston statesman and founder of the Sons of Liberty. Sam is on the left, John is on the right. Patrick Henry was a Virginian attorney and planter, famous for saying, "Give me liberty or give me death." Richard Henry Lee was a Virginian planter, merchant, and politician, one of the first to suggest American independence. And I think most of us know who this is, right? Virginia planter, military veteran of the French and Indian War, George Washington. So these are some of our distinguished leaders. I thought it'd be nice to actually stop and see who they are just for a second, even though the book doesn't do that too much. So let's move on. Next paragraph. And here we get into some really interesting stuff. Benjamin Franklin, one of the most respected men in the colonies, had been a leader in the Pennsylvania legislature. In 1765, he represented the colonies in London and helped win repeal of the Stamp Act. John Hancock of Massachusetts was a wealthy merchant. He funded many patriot groups, including the Sons of Liberty. The delegates chose Hancock to be president of the Second Continental Congress. Thomas Jefferson, only 32, was also a delegate. He served in the Virginia legislature. Jefferson was already known as a brilliant thinker and writer. So here's some of our other leaders that were here, right? I wonder if these new members of Congress had a great impact on the decisions that Congress had to make this year. In the Second Continental Congress, are they really going to turn things around? I wonder. Question and answer. Franklin, Hancock, Jefferson might have a great influence on the course of the Second Continental Congress, being the new members. So we're going to look forward to that. So who are they? I think we know these people too. Benjamin Franklin, Philadelphia printer, writer, philosopher. I mean, he is the role model for civic virtue in America. He was a civic activist. He was a diplomat. Should note that he comes to the Congress mostly because he just left Great Britain, where he was like cursed out by the British after what happened during the Boston Tea Party. So he was not happy with the British. John Hancock he's a Massachusetts merchant and statesman, served as president of the Second Continental Congress. John Hancock's known as a smuggler. He was big on smuggling. You didn't hear me say that. So yeah, he was known for smuggling goods. He did not like British taxes. And Thomas Jefferson, a Virginia statesman, diplomat, lawyer, architect, and philosopher. Most of us know who he is. We're going to find out more about him real soon. Last paragraph for this subtopic. The delegates at the Second Continental Congress had much to discuss. Though American and British blood had been spilled, they were not ready to vote for a break from Britain. It would be another year before Jefferson would write the Declaration of Independence. So there was a lot of reflection going on here, right? Not quick to do this. Many loyalists believed the fighting with the British would be futile, unproductive, and may have seen working on some compromise as more productive approach than independence. They're trying to be rational. They were trying to be reasonable. They didn't want to come across to King George or Parliament as being reactionary or radical or crazy. So they were trying to be as rational as they could with what was happening around them. Key actions. The Continental Congress did take steps to begin governing the colonies. It authorized the printing of money and set up a post office, with Franklin in charge. The Congress also formed committees to handle relations with Native Americans and foreign countries. Most important, it created the Continental Army. Unlike local militias, such a force could form and carry out an overall strategy for fighting the British. The Congress unanimously chose George Washington to command this army. Washington was an experienced soldier and a respected Southern planter. He left Philadelphia at once to take charge of forces in Boston. Personal observation. It's pretty clear that the Continental Congress is hoping for the best but preparing for the worst. They were setting up a government structure independent of British control. So they hoped they could resolve things, but you'll note that they didn't put all their eggs in one basket, as they say. They prepared to break away if they needed to. So that's interesting, right? So, sequence of events for governing. They set up a post office. They formed committees for relations with Native Americans and foreign armies, which I probably should have mentioned there, or foreign countries. They created a Continental Army with George Washington as commander. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Wait a minute, Washington lost at Fort Necessity back in the French and Indian War. What's his experience? I should point out to you, though, that Washington later on did actually train the Virginia militia to the point where it was a very professional force during the French and Indian War. And he also took part in the second attack on Fort Duquesne. And he was one of the people who actually decided the route to Fort Duquesne. And he was very influential in seeing that the British won, and Fort Duquesne became Fort Pitt, as we know. Pittsburgh today, if you're not familiar with that. So Washington did show excellent leadership qualities after Fort Necessity. So in case you're wondering why they choose a guy that lost battles, he actually improved over time. And he's going to prove that he can still improve over time in the Revolutionary War. The delegates then offered Britain a last chance to avoid war. They sent a petition or formal request to George III. Called the Olive Branch Petition, it assured the king that the colonists wanted peace. It asked him to protect the colonists' rights. The king rejected the petition. Instead, he prepared for war. He hired more than 30,000 German troops called Hessians to fight alongside the British troops. So, as you can see, George doesn't go along with this, right? The Second Continental Congress was not made up of extremists wanting revolution. They were willing to reconcile or restore relations with the king. The king rejected the reconciliation. He was going to win by force. So the significance of the Olive Branch petition was that it was an attempt to resolve matters with the king peacefully. But the king's rejection of any peaceful compromise made independence even more likely. So again, it's a two-way street when you look at this. It wasn't just the Continental Congress looking for trouble and wanting to break away. The King of England wasn't willing to work with them either. So that lack of compromise is what leads to the war. The war heats up. Congress learned that the British, I'm on page 130 for those of you who are not sure, and I'll start over. But Congress learned that the British troops in Canada were planning to invade New York. The Americans decided to strike first. A unit of patriots marched north from Fort Ticonderoga and captured Montreal. However, an American attack on Quebec led by Benedict Arnold failed, so that didn't work out too well for them. Okay, Canada is also under control by the British and provide a good base to attack the Americans. They're aware of that, and they did attempt to stop that. They failed here. Compare contrast. Arnold did not achieve the success in this campaign that he had in the attack on Fort Ticonderoga. So this is one time where Arnold didn't do so well. We will hear about him again. Washington reached the Boston area in July 1775, a few weeks after the Battle of Bunker Hill. The British held Boston, but Patriot militia ringed or surrounded the city. Although the size of the colonial force grew every day, Washington realized that the men were disorganized and lacked discipline. That's the ability to follow strict rules and procedures. Washington began the task of turning armed civilians into soldiers, and discipline is the ability to follow strict rules and procedures. So, yeah, he gets there and he sees an army that's really a mess, and he's got to find a way to resolve that because he had to start training them and preparing for real combat. Okay, what I know, Washington was shocked when he came to Massachusetts and saw the lack of military discipline demonstrated by the troops. Washington found the level of discipline non-existent in Massachusetts, so he set about establishing discipline when he took command. So immediately he does this. He attempts to do what he did in Virginia with their militia and make them into a fighting force, which he was successful at doing in Virginia, even though our textbook doesn't tell us about that. Washington also needed weapons. He arranged to have dozens of cannons hauled 300 miles from Fort Ticonderoga. Moving the guns was a huge effort. In March 1776, Washington believed his army was ready to fight. Under cover of darkness, he moved soldiers and cannons into position overlooking Boston, while the Redcoats slept. So again, Washington's leadership in Boston seems to have made a great difference in how the militias performed. And again, problem solution. Strategy, take the high ground, provide you with opportunities to view the enemy's movements, predict their actions, and choose the best places to attack. And Washington does it again. He takes that high ground. Notice this, taking the high ground being so important to battle. Okay, Siege of Boston is rather interesting. If you're not familiar with it, Washington needs artillery, cannons to threaten the British soldiers in Boston and British ships in the harbor. So there's Boston in the center, and you can see where Washington set up on both sides near Charlestown and really in a place called Wook's Hill and Dorchester Heights. During the winter of 75-76, it was actually the General Henry Knox, and we'll talk about him a couple times again. He moves cannon from Fort Ticonderoga by sled 300 miles to Boston. He arrives in January with a cannon. That's pretty amazing for New England, New York in the middle of the winter in the 1700s. March 1776, the guns are quickly moved by night and put into place, especially around Dorchester Heights. And if you look at my arrows on that map, you see why. It provided the high ground, and it provided the ability for Washington not only to fire upon Boston, but also Boston Harbor and any ships coming in and out of it. General Howe, the British commander, is going to withdraw from the city, giving the Americans an early victory in the Revolutionary War. I got a little picture of Henry Knox for you, too, so you know what he looked like. So page 129 has a map on it as well that shows this. So if you turn back to page 129, and the siege of Boston, Howe retreated to Halifax by heading east out to sea to escape the siege. Nook's Hill was problematic for Howe because the cannons there had the best chance to hit Boston and to hit Howe's ships in the harbor. They were under threat. So that really scared him out of the city. He didn't want to be there. So we see this General Howe, he's going to retreat out quick. So the move surprised the British, who realized they were now within easy reach of Washington's big guns. British General William Howe commanded his soldiers to board ships and withdraw from Boston. On March 17th, Washington led his jubilant troops into the city. They watched as British troops sailed away to Halifax, Nova Scotia, a part of Canada. Okay, the victory probably gave the Americans great hope. However, let's be honest, the British just retreated. They're probably going to be back. In fact, using the term Empire Strikes Back here would be appropriate. Okay, Washington and Henry Knox. Here's your question and answer. George Washington and Henry Knox they played key roles in the defeat of the British in Boston in March 1776. This gave the Americans a sense of hope in ending British control of the colonies, perhaps even getting independence. Moving toward independence, many colonists held on to the hope that the colonies could remain part of Great Britain. Still, support for independence was growing. It was inspired in no small part by the writer Thomas Paine. Paine arrived in the colonies from England in 1774. He soon caught the revolutionary spirit. In January 1776, he published a pamphlet called Common Sense. In bold language, Paine called for a complete break with British rule. And here's a quote from it. Everything that is right or reasonable pleads for separation. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice nature cries, 'tis time to part. Again, this is from Common Sense. Paine is basically saying that the British have killed so many already. To surrender to them now would be foolish. And Paine's thinking on this matter demonstrates how American thinking is changing. This is really, I can either call this continuity and change, or I think it's more periodization, because we're seeing the end of the colonial period and really the beginning of the period of revolution with people who talk and act and write like Thomas Paine. And here's another line from Common Sense. And there's a picture of Thomas Paine, just so you can put a face with the name. Common Sense will tell us that the power which hath endeavored to subdue us is of all others the most improper to defend us. They don't have the ability to defend. The British can't claim to be the defenders of American liberties while taking away American liberties. And basically, that's what Thomas Paine is saying here. So it's a really good point, right? That people who try to control you, take away your freedoms and limit your opportunities or subdue you have no right to claim that they're defending you. Hey, that brings us to the end of this first section. That went quick. Okay, so the Second Continental Congress met in May of 1775. That included old members as well as some new members like Ben Franklin, John Hancock, and Thomas Jefferson. The new Congress began organizing government by establishing a post office, setting up committees, and choosing George Washington to command a Continental Army. They presented a petition for peace to King George called the Olive Branch Petition, which the king rejected. The war heated up in Massachusetts, but the conflict ended in victory as Washington surprised General Howe in Boston by taking the high ground around Boston and forcing him to retreat. Meanwhile, Thomas Paine was promoting independence in his pamphlet, Common Sense. I think that's a complete review of this entire section. So about questions. The individual that played the biggest role in the events of 1776 were the members of the Continental Congress such as Sam and John Adams, Richard Henry Lee, Patrick Henry, and the new members such as Benjamin Franklin, John Hancock, and Thomas Jefferson. However, George Washington and Thomas Paine likely played the great roles during the early period of fighting. Washington began organizing the Continental Army and successfully defeated the British in Boston, while Paine inspired notions of revolution in his pamphlet Common Sense. King George's rejection of the Olive Branch petition was a key factor in setting America on the road to declare independence. So I think that answers all the questions there. This reading could have been improved by providing more of the British perspective in these events. As an opinion, it was very likely the British are not retreating here, right? They're going to Halifax to regroup and attack. And the reading almost makes it like they ran away chicken. No, they didn't. They were not in a good strategic position. They were outclassed tactically with the high ground being taken, so they left to fight another day. That's not stupidity. That's kind of smart. That Americans may have been too confident in themselves at this point. So yeah, I would have liked something in the reading to reflect that the British are not just getting at it dodge. They're coming back, and they're coming back strong. Let's not forget that. So, hey, that wraps up this section. There's your source information. We've talked about this. This read along is created for educational use only as a supplemental tool, should not be sold or purchased in any manner. I thank you for being here, and I will catch you in the second section when you get there. Have a nice day.